My name is Clara Mitchell. I am 29 years old. And Christmas used to be my favorite time of year. I thought going home last December would finally bring me comfort after my divorce. Maybe even a chance to feel like part of the family again. But instead of warmth, I walked into a performance. A stage set to showcase my brother, his perfect fiancée, and their powerful family. I sat there quietly as their voices grew louder, comparing, dismissing, reminding me of everything I was not, and just when I thought I could bear it, my mother stood up, lifted her glass, laughed in front of everyone, and declared the words that cut through me like a blade, "We're ashamed of you." The room froze. Forks dropped. No one spoke. What happened next is the moment I stopped being their scapegoat and started telling the truth. Stay with me until the end. Because this Christmas dinner did not just break me. It exposed everything my family had tried to hide for years, but before that night could ever happen. Before the laughter turned cruel and the words carved into me. There was a time when Christmas meant safety, warmth, and a house filled with light. Christmas used to be my favorite time of year. I can still close my eyes and remember the smell of my mother Evelyn's apple pie drifting through every corner of our house in Springfield, Ohio. My father Robert would be outside stringing lights along the roof, his breath visible in the cold air, humming along to carols on the radio. My younger brother Daniel would be in the living room shaking presents and laughing when Mom scolded him gently. Back then, it felt like nothing could touch the warmth inside that house. I was the older child, the one who helped Mom stir the pie filling and carried boxes of decorations down from the attic. In those moments, I felt like we were a family in perfect sync. But as the years went on, the balance shifted. Daniel's grades, his baseball trophies, his scholarships, they all seemed to matter more. Every compliment, every proud smile, every guest who came over heard about his achievements first. I was still part of the family. But slowly, I became the one in the background. The girl who was supposed to keep quiet and not rock the boat. The memories still glow in my mind. But they carry a different weight now. When I walk through Springfield's downtown during December, past the old church and the decorated lampposts, I can feel both the nostalgia and the sting. So much has changed. At 29, I found myself starting over. My marriage had ended. Not with a dramatic explosion, but with a steady unraveling until there was nothing left to save. I moved out of the apartment I had shared with my ex-husband and packed my life into the trunk of my car. There was no welcome committee. No family arms opening wide. Just me. Exhausted. Driving back to the same small town where I had once dreamed of leaving for good. I ended up renting a one-bedroom apartment above Mrs. Green's Bakery on Main Street. She was 71. With quick eyes and a kind smile. And when I told her I was between jobs and trying to get back on my feet, she offered me a small discount on rent if I helped her with bookkeeping once a week. The space was barely 400 square feet, with paint peeling in some corners and a constant undertone of cinnamon and fresh bread in the air. But it was mine. I remember the first night I slept there. I sat on the edge of my bed, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, listening to the hum of the ovens downstairs. I thought about how far I had fallen from the picture my parents once painted of me. To them, I was supposed to be the example, the one who married well, had children, settled into the kind of life that could be bragged about over coffee after church. Instead, I was divorced, scraping by, and living above a bakery. One afternoon, not long after moving in, I walked down to the bakery and found Miss Green humming as she kneaded dough. She looked up and asked how I was settling in. I told her I was fine. Still adjusting. She smiled and said sometimes the smallest places become the safest ones. It struck me because she was right. That little apartment was the first place I felt like I didn't have to pretend. Still. Every time Christmas lights went up around town, I felt the pull of old memories. I would picture my father carefully adjusting the big wreath on the front door, my mother arranging the nativity set on the mantel, Daniel showing off some new award while relatives clapped. I would picture myself too, standing nearby, hoping for approval that rarely came. That December, as the snow started to dust the sidewalks, I knew I would have to face it all again. My mother had already called to remind me about the Christmas dinner. She sounded cheerful, almost overly so. As if rehearsing for an audience, she asked me to bring dessert if I wanted, though she quickly added she had everything covered already. I hung up the phone with a knot in my stomach, unsure if I was being invited as family or tolerated as an obligation. I walked back into my apartment and looked around at the bare walls, the secondhand furniture I had picked up from thrift stores, the small artificial tree I had decorated with dollar store ornaments. It was not grand, but it was honest. It was my life, as it really was. I sat by the window, watching the snow fall on Main Street. Couples walked past carrying shopping bags. Children pointed at the lights strung across the lampposts. Laughter echoed down the block. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass and whispered to myself that I would get through it. Christmas used to mean warmth and togetherness. But now, it was a reminder of how fragile those things had always been. The pie smell from the bakery drifted up again, and I closed my eyes. For a moment, I was back in the old kitchen, helping Mom roll out the crust, listening to Daniel brag about some game, watching my father sip coffee. For a moment, it almost felt safe. Then I opened my eyes to the small apartment around me and the reality of the life I was living now. I took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and reminded myself that this was just the beginning of something different. I didn't know what the next chapter of my life would look like, but I knew it would be mine, even if no one else approved. And so I sat there, in the dim light of my apartment above the bakery, the snow falling steadily outside, caught between the weight of old Christmas memories and the fragile hope of starting over. The marriage had not collapsed in one night. It unraveled slowly, thread by thread, until I realized I was holding something that no longer resembled love. When I first married Thomas Reynolds at 23, I believed we were building the kind of life people envied. We had met at Ohio State, him studying finance, me in marketing. He was charming, ambitious, the kind of man my parents approved of instantly. At our wedding reception, my mother cried tears of joy and told me I had done everything right. For a while, I believed her. The early years were filled with dinner parties and carefully posed photos, the two of us smiling like we had the world figured out. But behind closed doors, the cracks formed. I remember setting the table with candles, cooking his favorite meals, waiting for him to walk through the door. Some nights he did, offering a distracted kiss before checking emails. Other nights he called to say he had to stay late, though his voice carried the kind of excitement that had nothing to do with me. At first I convinced myself it was the stress of his job at a Columbus investment firm. He was moving up quickly, managing accounts, traveling for client meetings. I told myself every marriage went through seasons, that if I stayed patient, it would balance out. But patience became silence, and silence became loneliness. There was one evening I will never forget. I had planned a small dinner, roasted chicken, and a bottle of wine we had been saving since our honeymoon. He came home 2 hours late. Loosened, eyes bright with some joke he refused to explain. He sat down, scrolled through his phone, and barely touched his food. I asked what was so funny, and he said it was nothing. Just work. The way he smiled at that screen told me otherwise. Months later, I found the messages. They were not explicit, at least not in the way that could be held up as proof. But they were intimate. Long late-night conversations with a woman named Erica from his office. Inside jokes. Encouragement. Words like miss you. When I confronted him, he did not apologize. He called me needy, said I misunderstood, claimed it was harmless, but I had seen the light in his eyes when he texted her. That light had been missing when he looked at me. I suggested counseling. desperate to salvage what we had spent years building. He laughed and told me I was dramatic, that no one needed therapy for friendship. The cruelty was in how easily he dismissed me, as though my pain was an inconvenience. The next weeks were a blur of arguments and cold silences. Finally, one morning in February 2022, I packed a suitcase and told him I was leaving. He barely looked up from his laptop. Filing for divorce was brutal. We fought over everything. Even the coffee maker we had received as a wedding gift. By the time the papers were signed that summer, I was drained emotionally and financially. The apartment we had shared in Columbus was too expensive on my salary alone. So I gave it up. I drove back to Springfield with boxes of clothes and a heart that felt heavier than the car itself. When I told my parents, I expected at least a measure of comfort. Instead, I heard questions about what I had done wrong. My mother suggested, maybe if I had been more supportive, he would not have strayed. My father said nothing at all. Just shook his head. Daniel, ever the golden boy, mentioned that Thomas had always seemed like a good man. Their words stung more than the betrayal itself. It was as if they believed I had failed at the most important role I was supposed to play. I remember standing in my small apartment above the bakery, staring at the cracked ceiling, replaying their reactions. There was no, "Are you okay?" "No, we will help you through this." Just disappointment. As though my divorce embarrassed them more than it hurt me. One night, I sat on the floor, surrounded by stacks of unopened boxes. And I said aloud to the empty room that I would never pretend again. I would not put on the smile at dinner parties. I would not keep cooking dinners for someone who barely noticed. If happiness was not real, I would rather face the loneliness honestly than live another day inside a lie. The snow outside that evening glowed under the street lamps, muffling the town in silence. I wrapped myself in a blanket, pulled my knees to my chest, and listened to the distant hum of the ovens downstairs. For the first time in years, even in the ache of solitude, I felt something steady inside me. It was not joy. Not yet. But it was resolve. I did not know what the future would look like, only that it had to be different. My marriage had ended in pieces, and my family had turned their backs. But I was still here, alone in that apartment above Main Street. I made a vow to myself. I would never again settle for pretending. I leaned back against the wall, closed my eyes, and let the smell of fresh bread drift through the cracks in the floor. The world outside kept moving. People laughed. Cars passed. Snow fell. And I sat there quietly, holding on to the only thing I could trust. The promise that I would rebuild my life on something true. A few weeks later, an email arrived that made me sit up straight in my chair. It was from Dayton Digital Solutions, a growing firm I had interviewed with back in the fall. My hands trembled as I opened it. Reading the words I had been hoping for, they were offering me the position of senior marketing coordinator starting in January. For the first time in months, I felt my chest expand with something close to pride. I read the message over and over. Not just for the details of salary and benefits, but for the validation hidden between the lines. Someone believed in me enough to hire me for a role that carried weight and responsibility. It was not a pity offer or a temporary fix. It was an acknowledgement of the skills I had built over years of pushing through. Even when my personal life was falling apart, I called Mrs. Green downstairs to share the news. She wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron, gave me a wide smile, and said she knew I would land on my feet. She promised to bake an extra pie in my honor that evening. And for a moment, the scent of cinnamon and apples meant something new. It meant hope. I spent the next week preparing for the transition. I bought a new blazer from a thrift shop in Dayton, had it tailored so it fit perfectly, and updated my portfolio with campaigns I had led. Every small step felt like laying bricks for a foundation that was finally my own. When I told myself I would rebuild on something true, this was what I meant. Still, there was a shadow trailing behind the excitement. Springfield was a small town, and people talked. At the coffee shop near the square, I overheard two women mentioning my name in hushed voices. One said she heard I had been left because I could not keep a man happy. The other shook her head and said I was unstable, moving back and forth between jobs. I sat there with my cup, Shakespearening, wondering how quickly gossip traveled from kitchen tables to the wider world. Those whispers became a low hum in the back of my mind as I prepared for Christmas dinner at my parents' house. I wanted to share my job news proudly, to prove I was standing again. But I worried that somehow the wrong version of my story had already reached them. In Springfield, image mattered. A woman could endure misery in silence and still be praised for staying, but leaving, even for the sake of honesty, branded her as reckless. One afternoon, I stopped by the library to use the printer for some forms. The librarian, a woman who had known me since childhood, asked how I was doing. I told her about the new job, and she smiled politely, though her eyes carried something else, a flicker of doubt. As I walked away, I wondered if she too had heard the stories. It seemed my divorce had not only severed my marriage, but had become a public spectacle for others to dissect. I tried to push the doubts aside by focusing on what I could control. At night, I drafted strategies for the accounts I would be managing, envisioning presentations, brainstorming social media campaigns. I let myself imagine walking into the Dayton office with confidence, my head held high, coworkers nodding in approval as I introduced myself. Those images were fragile, but they kept me moving. The closer Christmas came, the more conflicted I felt. I wanted to tell my family, to stand at that dinner table and say I was not the failure they thought I was. But I also knew how quickly their attention could turn dismissive. Daniel's engagement to Victoria, her prestigious medical residency, their wedding plans in Italy. All of it seemed designed to overshadow whatever news I had. One evening my mother called. Her voice was cheerful, rehearsed almost, as she reminded me about the time of dinner and listed the guests who would be there. She mentioned the Hayes family, Victoria's parents, and my aunt and uncle from Cincinnati. Her tone carried pride when she spoke of them, as though their presence elevated the event. When I told her I had good news to share, she paused, then said I could tell everyone at dessert. When the mood was lighter, I hung up the phone feeling as though my achievement had already been boxed into a corner. I sat at my small kitchen table, staring at the stack of printed papers from Dayton Digital Solutions. The offer letter signed and ready. The smell of bread baking downstairs rose through the floorboards. Warm and steady. I reminded myself that their opinions did not change the reality. I had earned this role, and no amount of gossip or dismissive glances could erase that. Still, I could not ignore the unease. At a networking event in Dayton, I overheard a colleague mention that personal reputation mattered as much as professional skill. A whisper of instability, a hint of unreliability, could jeopardize a contract. I felt my stomach tighten. If those Springfield rumors bled into my new role, could they tarnish me before I had a chance to prove myself? I drove home that night, with the highway stretching ahead, headlights carving through the dark. I thought about the difference between who I really was and the stories being told. For years, I had shaped myself around what others believed, twisting into someone who would be accepted. That had left me hollow. Now I had to decide if I would let the whispers define me again, or if I would walk into Dayton with my head up, regardless of the noise. When I pulled into the lot behind the bakery, the snow had started again, thin flakes drifting lazily in the streetlights. I carried the folder with my offer letter inside and set it carefully on my nightstand, as if it were a fragile treasure, sitting on the bed. I let the weight of it settle. It was more than a job. It was proof that I was not broken beyond repair, that I had something real to bring to the table. Christmas was only a few days away. I knew I would walk into that house with decorations gleaming, voices rising in praise of Daniel and Victoria. And I would have to find the courage to share my news in a room that might not want to hear it. I did not know if they would dismiss me again, if my words would be swallowed by laughter or pity, but I knew this much: the offer in my hand was mine, And for the first time in a long time, so was the future. Daniel had always been the pride of the Mitchell family. At 26, he was already working as a mechanical engineer in Columbus. With a salary that gave my parents something to brag about at every church potluck and family gathering, pictures of him in his cap and gown from Ohio State still hung prominently in the hallway of our childhood home, framed with care, while my own milestones had quietly disappeared into storage boxes in the attic. His engagement to Victoria Hayes only elevated his golden child status. Victoria was polished, beautiful, and accomplished. She was in the middle of her pediatric residency at Riverside Hospital, the daughter of a well-known surgeon and a mother who chaired half the charity events in Franklin County. Her family carried the kind of social weight my mother Evelyn craved. And from the moment Daniel introduced Victoria at a 4th of July barbecue 2 summers earlier, I knew she had already been written into our family's narrative as the perfect addition as Christmas approached. I could sense that the holiday had become less about tradition and more about presentation. My mother called nearly every day, her voice filled with an excitement that sounded rehearsed. She listed the dishes she was preparing, the seating arrangement, even the crystal stemware she had polished for the occasion. When I offered to help, she brushed me aside with a cheerful but firm tone. Everything was under control, she said. I should just focus on showing up. One afternoon, while I was folding laundry in my small apartment, she called again. I balanced the phone between my shoulder and ear as she rattled off details about floral centerpieces and candle holders. I finally interrupted to ask if I could bring something to contribute. There was a pause, just long enough for me to feel it in my chest. Then she said that Victoria's mother was already bringing pastries from a bakery in Columbus, and Aunt Linda had offered to handle appetizers. Maybe I could bring napkins, she added lightly. Before moving on to how she had hired a string quartet to play during cocktails, her words landed like a stone in my stomach. Napkins. Out of all the possibilities, that was what she trusted me with. I tried to laugh it off, but as soon as the call ended, I sank onto the couch, staring at the folded clothes in my lap. No matter how old I became, no matter what I accomplished, I was still the extra place setting at her perfect table, determined not to let it crush me. I decided to pour my energy into something meaningful for gifts. I spent 2 evenings after work walking up and down Main Street, stopping at local shops to find thoughtful presents. For my father, I discovered a vintage set of wrenches at an antique store. Polished steel that reminded me of the ones his father once used in his garage. For my mother, I bought a hand-painted ornament from a local artist, delicate holly branches winding around porcelain. For Daniel and Victoria, I found an elegant silver picture frame, hoping they would use it for their engagement photo. It was not extravagant, but it was chosen with care. I wrapped everything carefully on my small kitchen table, using paper I had bought at a discount store. I tied each package with ribbon and labeled them in my neat handwriting. Looking at the small stack, I felt a flicker of pride. My gifts might not cost as much as the Hayes family's contributions, but they came from me, from thought and memory, not from a credit card limit. As the day of the dinner drew closer, the tension in my chest grew heavier. I imagined walking into that house, every detail staged like a performance, and felt myself shrinking already. In my head, I rehearsed how I would share the news about my new job. I practiced saying it plainly, with confidence, not begging for approval but claiming my space. Yet each time I said it aloud, I pictured my mother's polite smile fading quickly into a brighter one for someone else's accomplishment. On Christmas Eve, she called again, her tone brisk with last-minute instructions. She told me to arrive early so the photographer she had hired could take family pictures before the guests settled. I asked if she wanted me to bring the gifts in a certain way, perhaps under the tree. But she cut me off. Just make sure you look nice, she said. The Hayes family has never been here before, and I want everything to be perfect. Her words echoed long after the call ended. Look nice. Be presentable. Contribute nothing but your appearance. I stared out the window at the falling snow, gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself. I whispered that I was more than decoration. Even if they refused to see it, I placed my wrapped gifts by the door and set my offer letter from Dayton Digital Solutions on top of my dresser. Tomorrow I would step into that house, carrying both. One was a symbol of love, the other of independence. Together they reminded me that I had something worth bringing. Even if my family chose not to notice, the oven downstairs clicked off as Mrs. Green finished baking, and the silence that followed pressed in around me. I sat down at the table, my hands resting on the stack of presents, and closed my eyes. For a brief moment, I pictured my father opening the tool set with a smile, my mother hanging the ornament on the tree, Daniel and Victoria placing their photo in the frame. I held on to that image, fragile and fleeting, hoping it would carry me through what was coming. The drive back to Springfield on Christmas Day felt both familiar and foreign. The highway was quiet. The snow plowed neatly to the sides, leaving only patches of ice that glistened under the pale winter sun. I kept the radio low, holiday songs playing softly, but they only reminded me of years when I had sung along without hesitation. On the passenger seat sat the stack of wrapped gifts, each one tied carefully. A fragile attempt to carry love into a house where I never quite felt it was welcome. As I turned onto Maplewood Drive, my parents' street, I slowed almost instinctively. The houses were lined with wreaths and blinking lights, but theirs stood out. Every inch of the roof was outlined with twinkling white bulbs, garland wrapped tightly around the porch columns, and two oversized nutcrackers flanked the front steps. A photographer was already adjusting a camera near the driveway, his breath visible in the crisp air. My mother had not exaggerated. This was no simple family Christmas. This was a production. I parked along the curb and sat for a moment, staring at the red front door adorned with the largest wreath I had ever seen. My heart thudded as I took a deep breath, forcing my hands to stop trembling. I picked up the gifts, steadied myself, and walked up the steps. The door opened before I could knock. Daniel stood there, dressed sharply in a navy sweater and gray slacks, his smile wide and polished. He hugged me quickly, the kind of hug that said welcome but do not linger. Behind him I saw Victoria, radiant in a cream-colored dress that hugged her figure perfectly. Her dark hair fell in waves around her shoulders, and a string of pearls caught the light as she moved forward. "Clara, you made it," Daniel said, stepping aside. Victoria glided toward me with that flawless smile, warm but practiced. "So good to see you again," she said. "I love your coat. That color really works for you." Her compliment, though wrapped in honey, carried an edge I could not quite place. The way she emphasized that color made it sound as though the coat was doing all the work. Not me. I forced a polite smile, thanked her, and stepped inside. The living room spread out before me like a magazine cover. The Christmas tree, taller than I remembered, sparkled with coordinated ornaments of gold and red. The mantel held garland and white candles, perfectly arranged. My father Robert stood near the fireplace, laughing with Dr. Hayes, his voice louder than usual as if performing for an audience. On the couch, Aunt Linda and Uncle Mark sipped wine, while their son Ethan adjusted his tie. Looking every inch, the young attorney eager to impress. Every head turned as I walked in, each pair of eyes assessing me, weighing me silently. I nodded, offered greetings, and placed the gifts gently under the tree. My mother swept in from the kitchen wearing an emerald green dress, her hair styled elegantly. She kissed my cheek without disturbing her lipstick and whispered, "You look nice, dear." Then she turned back to Mrs. Hayes and continued a conversation about a recent charity gala. I stood for a moment at the edge of the room, invisible despite the greetings. I watched my family and their guests chatter easily, laughter rolling across the room like music I did not know the lyrics to. I tried to join a conversation near the tree, but Ethan asked about my work with the kind of polite detachment reserved for small talk. When I explained I had recently accepted a new position in Dayton, his eyes flickered with vague acknowledgement before he turned to Daniel, asking about his upcoming trip to Italy. The photographer called for everyone to gather for pictures. We arranged ourselves in front of the tree. Daniel and Victoria were placed in the center, their smiles perfect. I was guided to the edge, holding my hands together as the camera flashed. Each click felt like proof that I was a footnote in their carefully composed story. Afterward, I retreated briefly to the kitchen to collect myself. I stood near the counter, looking at the rows of crystal glasses, waiting for champagne. The plates of hors d'oeuvre, arranged with military precision. My mother brushed past me carrying a tray. Focused and efficient, I asked if she needed help, but she shook her head quickly. "Everything is taken care of," she said, then hurried out. I leaned against the counter, exhaling slowly. The voices from the living room swelled again, Victoria's laughter ringing clear. I straightened, squared my shoulders, and walked back in. When I returned, Victoria was standing near the fireplace, the light catching her pearls as she spoke about her residency schedule. Mrs. Hayes beamed with pride while my mother listened, eyes shining. Daniel stood beside her, his hand at the small of her back, nodding along as though her accomplishments were his own. "You must be so exhausted with that workload," my mother said admiringly, balancing such a demanding career and planning a wedding at the same time. "It is remarkable." Victoria tilted her head modestly, her smile never faltering. "It is busy," she admitted. "But when you love what you do, it does not feel like work. I am just grateful for the support I have from Daniel and both our families." Then she turned her eyes to me, her smile still bright, and added, "Not everyone is lucky enough to have that kind of foundation." "Right, Clara." The words slipped into the room with a sweetness that masked the sting. A few guests chuckled lightly, though I could not tell if it was at my expense or just polite noise. My cheeks burned as I forced a smile, my heart pounding against my ribs. I excused myself to pour a glass of water, gripping the glass tighter than necessary. In that moment I realized this was no simple dinner. Every detail, every exchange, was staged to highlight success, to showcase perfection, and I was the contrast, the reminder of what failure looked like. I swallowed the water, set the glass down carefully, and steadied my breath. The night was only beginning, and I knew the hardest part was still to come. I walked back into the living room and found the conversations flowing as though they were part of a script. Ethan Carter stood by the piano, glass of wine in hand, telling a story about a high-profile case he had worked on in Cincinnati. His voice carried with the kind of confidence that came from knowing everyone was listening. He described long hours, strategy meetings, and the satisfaction of winning a verdict that had protected a corporation from what he called frivolous claims. My Uncle Mark chuckled proudly, clapping him on the back as if Ethan had saved the city itself. Across the room, Daniel had gathered a circle of attention with Victoria at his side. He was describing the villa they had chosen for their wedding in Tuscany, his hands moving as though painting the landscape in the air. Victoria filled in details about the vineyards surrounding the estate, the chapel with stone walls dating back hundreds of years, the view that overlooked rolling hills. My mother's eyes sparkled as if she had already transported herself there, basking in the reflected glow of their future celebration. Mrs. Hayes chimed in about the charities she was supporting, listing fundraisers and gala events, while her husband spoke about his work with children's hospitals. Each sentence seemed crafted to showcase generosity and influence. My father listened intently, nodding with admiration, as if their achievements elevated our entire family simply by proximity. I sat on the edge of a chair near the tree, holding my glass of water, waiting for a chance to contribute. When a pause finally came, I cleared my throat and said I had been offered a new position in Dayton. I explained briefly about the company, how quickly it was growing, and how excited I was to take on more responsibility as senior marketing coordinator. The response was immediate but shallow, a few polite smiles. A murmured, "Oh, that's nice." A nod from Aunt Linda before she shifted back to listening to Victoria describe dress fittings in Chicago. The words evaporated into the air like steam from a kettle. There for a moment before vanishing. My chest tightened, but I forced my smile to stay. Then my mother's voice cut through the hum of conversation. Louder than before. She had turned to Mrs. Hayes. Her tone casual, yet deliberate. As she said how grateful she was that Daniel would be handling more responsibilities now that he was preparing for marriage. She mentioned that the old Mitchell house, the one my grandparents had left behind when they passed, would of course be under Daniel's management. It took me a moment to process what she had said. My head lifted sharply, my eyes locking on her, the house on Oakwood Avenue. Worth nearly $450,000. The house where I had spent countless childhood summers had always been described as a family property. There had never been a conversation about handing it over to one child. But my mother spoke as though it was settled, she continued, smiling warmly at Victoria and her parents, saying that Daniel would know how to care for the property, how to keep it in the family's name, how to make the best use of such a valuable asset. She gestured with pride toward him, while my father nodded silently. My throat went dry. I wanted to speak, but the words refused to come. The room had shifted. The spotlight once again placed on Daniel. While I sat at the edge, like an invisible guest in my own family, I saw Victoria glance at me, then quickly turn away. Her expression polite but detached. Ethan smirked faintly, as if he had just witnessed something expected. Aunt Linda pressed her lips together, sipping her wine without comment. No one questioned it. No one even hesitated. The weight of it settled on me slowly, like ice forming layer by layer. I was being erased in real time, in front of guests, in front of extended family. My mother had decided that what was once shared now belonged to Daniel alone. I set my glass down carefully on the table, afraid that if I held it any longer, my hands would betray the tremor running through me. My chest ached as I forced my breathing steady. But inside I could feel something tearing. All around me the conversation picked up again. Laughter filling the space. Questions about the villa in Tuscany. About which charity event Mrs. Hayes would host next. My mother moved smoothly between groups, radiant, in command of her stage, and I sat still, my body rigid. Realizing that my place in this family had never been secure, the realization stung sharper than any slight before. It was not just about being overlooked or dismissed. It was about being written out of the story completely. I pressed my palms against my knees, grounding myself, refusing to let the room see the way my heart was breaking. I knew then that my silence would not protect me. My mother's performance had made it clear. In her perfect narrative, I did not exist. The sound of Daniel's laughter rang out again, bright and full, while Victoria leaned into his shoulder, glowing. The lights on the tree flickered softly. I stayed where I was, holding my composure. Though inside every memory of home was unraveling thread by thread, dinner was announced with the kind of flourish my mother loved. She swept into the dining room carrying the first platter of carved turkey, her smile wide, her posture stiff with pride. The table was set like a spread from a magazine. Silver polished to a mirror shine, crystal glasses catching the glow from the chandelier. Each place card had been written in her looping script. I found myself seated between Aunt Linda and Mrs. Hayes, directly across from Daniel and Victoria. As plates were passed and glasses filled, the conversation turned quickly into a parade of accomplishments. Ethan began by describing another case at his firm, one involving environmental regulations. He spoke at length about strategy, about hours poured into research, about how proud his partners were of his work. Uncle Mark leaned in, eyes shining with approval. nodding along as if every word confirmed that his son was destined for greatness. Victoria took the opportunity to share details about her residency. She explained her grueling shifts, how she rotated through pediatrics, and how she was often on call at all hours. The room listened intently, murmuring admiration, while my mother reached for her hand across the table. "You are the perfect example of a modern woman," she said proudly, balancing such a demanding career while preparing to build a family. "That is something special," I smiled tightly, feeling the sting in her words. They were not meant only to elevate Victoria. They were meant to remind me of what I had not achieved. At one point, Daniel leaned forward, describing the itinerary of their upcoming trip to Italy. Speaking of private wine tastings and villa tours, my father laughed warmly, raising his glass in a small toast to their future. Around me, forks clinked against china. Voices overlapped, the air thick with self-congratulation. I waited, hoping for a moment when I could contribute. Finally, Aunt Linda asked politely how my new role would work in Dayton. I began to explain, telling her about the clients I would be managing, how the company had grown steadily, and how I was eager to shape campaigns from the ground up. Before I could finish, Henry Carter interrupted from further down the table. He chuckled, shaking his head, and said those small firms come and go all the time. Startups are risky, he added, as though dismissing me with a single wave of his fork. If you want real stability, you go with established names, not flashy little experiments. The words stung more than I wanted to admit. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to explain that Dayton Digital was not just a startup, but a rapidly growing company with steady contracts. But Ethan smirked, leaned back in his chair, and muttered something about hoping I had a backup plan. The chuckle that followed made my cheeks flush hot. Silence stretched for a beat before the conversation pivoted back to Victoria. My mother asked about the wedding dress, leaning in eagerly, and Mrs. Hayes chimed in about boutiques in Chicago where they had shopped together. Everyone else seemed absorbed, nodding, smiling, asking questions. My words, my effort to share something meaningful, had already dissolved into nothing. I picked up my wine glass, holding it carefully. My hand trembled as I lifted it, the pale liquid swirling dangerously near the rim. I pressed the base against the table for steadiness, my knuckles white. No one noticed. Or maybe they did and chose to ignore it. My mother's voice rose again, clear and deliberate. She told Victoria how proud she was to have her as part of our family, how she admired her ability to remain gracious under pressure, how she saw her as a role model for what a young woman should be. Her eyes flicked toward me briefly, no longer than a heartbeat. But it was enough. The contrast was drawn. Victoria was the shining daughter they wanted, and I was the reminder of everything they thought had gone wrong. My chest tightened as laughter rippled around the table. Forks scraped plates, glasses clinked, compliments flowed. I held my glass still, willing my hand not to shake, swallowing hard against the burn in my throat. The humiliation pressed deeper with each word, each glance that slid past me as if I were furniture. I forced myself to breathe, to keep my face calm, but inside something hot and bitter coiled, tighter and tighter. The sound of my brother's laugh rang out again, blending with Victoria's soft chuckle. My mother beamed. My father looked content, and the Hayes family shone with quiet approval. The scene glistened like perfection to anyone looking in from the outside, but beneath the surface, I could feel it. A fault line growing inside me, a pressure that no polite smile could hold back forever. I lowered my eyes to the tablecloth, tracing the embroidered holly with the tip of my finger, clinging to the movement as if it could anchor me. The room roared with conversation, but in my head, everything narrowed to the fragile balance of the glass in my hand and the steady pulse of shame pounding in my chest. I forced a smile that felt like it belonged to someone else and lifted the fork to my plate. though my appetite had vanished hours ago. The voices around me rose and fell like waves, laughter cresting at all the right moments. But I was drifting further and further away from the shore of belonging. The pie in front of me looked perfect, golden crust glistening under the chandelier. But every bit felt impossible. Doctor Hayes leaned back in his chair, his glass of red wine catching the glow of the candles. His tone shifted, less casual and more sermon-like, as though he had been waiting for this moment. By the time you are in your late 20s, he said, you should already be settled. A career with stability, a strong partner, plans for the future. Life rewards those who stay the course and make wise choices. He nodded toward Daniel and Victoria, smiling as though they were his evidence, his model of what success was supposed to look like. The words rippled around the table, sinking into the eager nods of approval. My father made a low sound of agreement, a hum that carried weight. Aunt Linda dabbed her lips with her napkin and smiled toward Victoria, her eyes shining with approval. Uncle Mark added a remark about how true it was. That commitment was the foundation of everything. Their agreement felt suffocating, as though the walls had drawn closer with each nod. My fork rested uselessly against my plate, my hand trembling faintly. Dr. Hayes had not spoken my name, but I felt every word cut toward me, deliberate and sharp, each one a reminder of how little space I occupied in this room. I waited for someone to soften it, to offer balance, but no one did. Then my mother stood. The scrape of her chair against the polished hardwood silenced the table more effectively than a bell. Every head turned toward her. She held her glass high, her emerald dress shimmering under the chandelier, her face glowing with pride. I had seen this expression before at church gatherings, at charity events. When she stepped into a role she loved best, the master of ceremony, the queen of presentation. Well, she began, her voice full of theatrical sweetness, since we are all being so very honest tonight, I think it is time someone said what needed to be said. She paused, letting the anticipation build, scanning the table as though gathering permission from her audience. My breath hitched as I realized where this was heading, though I still prayed I was wrong. Her smile widened, her laugh rising sharp and clear. We're ashamed of you, the words struck like a blade. And her laughter followed, loud and unrestrained, ringing off the walls. She tilted her head back slightly, savoring the sound, while the rest of the table froze in uncomfortable shock. Then, slowly, the ripple spread. A chuckle from Ethan, low and smug. A half laugh from Uncle Mark, forced but complicit. Even Aunt Linda gave a small exhale through her nose, a sound that might have been disbelief, but carried no defense. Heat surged through me, my cheeks burning as though the chandelier's light had been focused solely on my skin. I searched desperately for someone to speak up, someone to stop this performance before it destroyed me completely. My father lowered his eyes, his mouth tightening, but he said nothing. Daniel shifted in his chair, looking momentarily uncomfortable, then looked back at his plate. Victoria laid a hand gently on his arm, her composure unshaken, her eyes downcast. I looked at Mrs. Hayes, hoping for at least a flicker of disapproval, but she only folded her napkin neatly in her lap, her polite smile unbroken, as though she had been watching a mildly distasteful but unsurprising spectacle. Dr. Hayes simply sipped his wine, his earlier lecture standing firm in the silence that followed. The laughter died, leaving a silence heavier than sound. The only noise was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the faint clink of a fork that slipped from someone's hand. My heart pounded so loudly, I was certain everyone could hear it. My mother stood above me, triumphant, her eyes shining not with shame, but with satisfaction, as if she believed she had done something noble. The words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. We're ashamed of you. I wanted to respond, to tell her she was wrong, that her cruelty said more about her than it did about me, but the weight of the silence pressed down, pinning me in place. No one at that table challenged her. No one defended me. Their silence was its own kind of agreement. Their stillness, a collective nod. I gripped the edge of my chair until my knuckles whitened. My body rigid against the urge to collapse, I stared down at the untouched pie. Its crust crumbling under the faint tremor of the table. The smell of cinnamon, once a comfort, turned sickly sweet. Cloying. Unbearable. When I finally looked up, I saw nothing but confirmation of what I had always feared. Daniel's lowered gaze. Unwilling to stand for me. My father's silence. The same silence that had filled our home when I was a child, whenever my mother's sharp words cut too deeply. My aunt and uncle's polite composure. Unwilling to risk their own comfort by objecting. The Hayes family's distance. Careful and detached. As though my humiliation was merely part of the evening's entertainment, the shame settled over me like a heavy cloak. This was not the subtle dismissal I had grown used to. The backhanded compliments. The quick redirections of conversation. This was public condemnation. Official and absolute. My mother had not only named it, she had demanded that everyone else bear witness. I felt my throat tighten, my chest constricting as though air itself was refusing to reach me. I picked up my glass of wine to steady my hands, but the liquid shook violently against the rim. My lips parted, but no words came. The room was still, the silence unbearable. Every face waiting, every breath held. I realized in that moment that this was not just my mother's voice. It was the voice of the entire room. By saying nothing, by laughing along, by staying silent, they had all declared the same thing. We're ashamed of you. The weight of it pressed deeper, branding me in front of everyone I had ever tried to please. And as I sat there, frozen under their collective gaze, I understood for the first time that the shame had never truly been mine to carry. It belonged to them. Yet they had placed it on me like a crown of thorns. Still, I sat in silence, the burn in my throat growing, my hands trembling in my lap. The chandelier light sparkled on crystal and silver. But the room felt darker than I had ever known. And in that darkness, I felt the first tremor of something dangerous rising inside me. Sharp and unyielding, waiting for its moment to be spoken. I pushed my chair back, and the sound echoed through the dining room, sharp against the silence that had smothered the air. Every head turned toward me, my legs trembled as I stood. But my voice, when it came, was calm. Each word measured like steel, sliding slowly from its sheath. You are ashamed of me, I said, looking directly at my mother. Let me tell you what shame really looks like. Her smile faltered. Her glass hovering mid-air, the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes fed the fire that had been burning inside me all evening. Shame is a mother who thought no one noticed when she spent long afternoons in 2008 with her tennis instructor. Richard. I was 19. But I was not blind. I saw the texts on your phone. The way you dressed for lessons like you were going on a date. The nights Dad stayed late at work because he had found out. Gasps rippled across the table. My father's face went white, his fork clattering onto the china. Aunt Linda pressed her hand to her chest. My mother's painted lips parted. But no words came. I stepped closer, my voice still quiet, but carrying in the heavy silence. And shame is a father who drank himself to sleep every night from 2010 to 2012, pretending he was fine. Do you think I did not smell the whiskey when you tucked me in? Dad, do you think I did not notice the bottles hidden behind the boxes of Christmas lights in the garage? My father's shoulders collapsed inward, his hand trembling as it reached for his glass, but stopped short. He looked at me with eyes full of something between guilt and sorrow, but he did not deny it. I turned toward my brother, my throat tightening, but my voice never breaking. And Daniel? The perfect son. Should I tell them about 2018? About the night Victoria confronted you after hearing rumors? And you came running to me begging for help to cover your tracks. Jennifer Morrison. Does that name sound familiar because it should? Victoria's head snapped toward him. Her face pale. Daniel's lips moved, but no sound came. His eyes darted between me and her. Panic rising like a tide, he could not control. I leaned on the back of my chair, steadying myself, my hands no longer shaking. Or should I talk about last month? Daniel, about those late-night texts you thought no one knew about. You told me you felt trapped, that you were not sure you wanted to get married, and that you needed someone to talk to. You did not realize I saved the messages. The silence was unbearable, the kind that hummed in the ears like a storm building. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his smirk gone. Mrs. Hayes gripped her napkin, her knuckles pale. Doctor Hayes coughed once but said nothing, his face unreadable. I let the silence stretch, each secret I had spoken sitting heavy in the air. I looked back at my mother, her face drained of color, her hand trembling against the stem of her glass. Her lips quivered as though she wanted to protest. But no sound came. For years you have all measured me against a standard none of you have lived up to. I said. You dressed me in shame to hide your own. You laughed at me tonight, called me a disappointment, erased me in front of guests. But the truth is this. The only thing you should be ashamed of is yourselves. The room had frozen solid. No one lifted a fork. No one touched their pie. No one dared to breathe too loudly. The chandelier light glittered cold across the silver and crystal. But all warmth had been sucked from the air. My mother finally broke. Her eyes filled, her lips trembling as tears spilled down her cheeks. She lowered her glass, her shoulders folding, as though the weight of everything I had said pressed down on her spine. A sound escaped her, soft at first, then rising into a sob that cracked through the silence like glass shattering. I stood perfectly still, watching as the woman who had laughed at me minutes before now shook with humiliation of her own making. The guests looked around, lost, as though no one knew whether to stand, to comfort, or to flee. The only sound in the room was her weeping, sharp and ragged, filling the house that had once been my home. My father stared down at his plate as if the design on the china could save him. His shoulders were hunched, his face drained of color, and he gripped the stem of his glass without drinking. He had always been a man of words, a storyteller at gatherings. But now his silence screamed louder than anything he could have said. Victoria's fork slipped from her hand, clattering against porcelain, the sound sharp in the frozen air. She turned her head toward Daniel, her eyes wide, her lips trembling. I could see the storm building inside her, disbelief and betrayal mixing in equal measure. Daniel reached for her hand, but she pulled back slightly, leaving his fingers suspended in the air. Across the table, Ethan Carter, who had smirked earlier, sat stiff and pale. He stared at his lap, the arrogance drained from his expression. His father cleared his throat, glancing quickly at his wife. Mrs. Hayes pressed her napkin into her lap with nervous fingers, her polished composure cracked by discomfort. They wanted to vanish, to excuse themselves. But no one dared to stand first. The laughter that had filled the room earlier had evaporated completely. It was as though the house itself had gone mute, holding its breath in the wake of what had been unleashed. Only my mother's sobbing broke the silence, her face buried in her hands as mascara streaked down her cheeks. I reached for my purse on the back of my chair and slid it over my shoulder. My hands moved slowly, deliberately, each motion echoing louder than words. The weight of the entire table's gaze followed me as I gathered the stack of wrapped gifts I had brought, the ones I had chosen so carefully in the hope of belonging. I tucked them neatly against my arm. I lifted my head, my voice clear and steady. If the truth makes you ashamed, then I am proud to be that shame. The words sliced through the air like the edge of a blade. No one answered. My mother sobbed harder. My father pressed his palm to his forehead, and Daniel lowered his eyes, unable to face the damage. Victoria's face had hardened now. Her gaze still fixed on him, but colder. Sharper. As if the future she had imagined was dissolving before her eyes, I pushed back from the table. The legs of the chair scraping against the floor. The sound final and jarring. No one tried to stop me. No hand reached out. No voice called after me. The only movement came from Mrs. Hayes as she leaned subtly toward her husband. Her expression tight, clearly desperate to leave without drawing more attention. I walked past the tree. Its twinkling lights glowing cheerfully in contrast to the wreckage that hung in the air. The ornaments shimmered with memories of Christmas mornings, long gone. Memories that now felt like illusions. At the doorway I paused, glancing back one last time. My mother was bent over, tears spilling onto her plate. My father sat hollow and still, his glass untouched. Daniel stared blankly at his lap, while Victoria's hand rested tensely on the table. Her diamond ring catching the light, but no longer carrying the same promise. The Carters shifted uncomfortably, their bodies angled toward the exit, unable to mask their eagerness to escape the ruins of the evening. The dining room, once the stage for their performance, had become a graveyard of silence. Knives and forks rested in abandoned positions, the apple pie untouched, the pastries congealing under the heat of the chandelier. The air itself felt heavy, as though the walls had absorbed the humiliation and held it there. I straightened my shoulders, tightened my grip on the gifts, and stepped out into the hallway. The sound of my heels on the hardwood echoed down the corridor, each step carrying me farther away from the collapse I had left behind. The door at the end of the hall seemed impossibly far, but with every step I felt the weight of their silence lift, replaced by something fierce and undeniable, my own voice. No longer buried, no longer ignored. When I reached the front door, I placed my hand on the knob, the cold brass steady under my palm. Behind me, I heard only the muffled sobs of my mother and the hollow stillness of those who had once thought laughter was strength. I opened the door slowly, the winter air rushing in sharp and clean. And for the first time that night, I felt like I could breathe. Snow crunched beneath my boots as I walked to my car, my arms still heavy with the stack of gifts no one had wanted. The house behind me glowed with lights, but to me, it looked like a stage set after the actors had fled. An empty shell. I slid into the driver's seat, the leather cold against my skin, and sat for a long moment with my hands gripping the steering wheel. The silence was profound, broken only by the faint hum of the heater when I turned the key. For the first time in years, I did not feel the need to rehearse explanations or search for approval. I had spoken, and the truth had landed. The days that followed carried ripples that spread farther than I had imagined. Daniel called me the next morning. His voice cracked through the phone. Urgent. Almost panicked. "Clara, you have to help me," he whispered, as if someone might overhear. "Victoria will not answer my calls. She said she needs time to think. You ruined everything." I closed my eyes, listening to the desperation that bled through his tone. But I felt nothing like guilt. I told him calmly that his choices had consequences, and this was not mine to fix. By the end of that week, word reached me through an aunt that the Hayes family had quietly withdrawn from the engagement. Victoria had told her parents she could not walk into a marriage built on secrets. They had stood by her decision, their silence with my family polite but distant. The image my parents had worked so hard to polish, the alliance they had wanted to display that Christmas night, was shattered in a matter of days. My father sent me a letter 2 weeks later. The handwriting was shaky but careful, every word pressed into the page as if he had thought long before writing it. He admitted to the years he had drowned himself in alcohol, the nights he had pretended not to notice the hurt in my eyes. He wrote that he had started attending meetings at a church basement in Springfield. Alcoholics Anonymous sessions he had sworn he would never need. He told me he was sorry, not for the family, not for appearances, but for me. I held that letter in my hands for hours, rereading it until the paper softened at the edges. It was not absolution, but it was real. My mother, however, was not done. I heard from a cousin that she had begun meeting with an attorney about the old Mitchell house. She claimed Daniel should be the sole heir, that I was unstable, unfit to handle something so important. The news lit a fresh fire inside me. I had once assumed her decisions were final, but now I knew better. At work in Dayton, I confided in a colleague named Karen, a senior account manager who had become a friend. She introduced me to her husband, a real estate lawyer. We met for coffee one evening in January, and he explained the terms of my grandparents' will. Unless I signed away my rights, I remained a legal heir. My mother's maneuvering could not erase me so easily. The knowledge steadied me, as if I had been handed a shield I had never known was mine. Around the same time, I began seeing Dr. Rachel Kim, a therapist recommended by a coworker. I sat on her worn leather couch during our first session and told her everything. From the divorce to the Christmas dinner that had collapsed into ruin. She listened without judgment, her eyes steady, her presence calm. When I finished, she leaned forward slightly and said, "Clara, what you describe is a classic scapegoat role." She explained how families often choose one member to carry their unspoken shame, how they use that person to deflect from their own failures. "It is not about your worth," she said softly. "It is about their need to survive their own secrets. For years they made you hold it for them. And on Christmas, you set it down." Her words cracked something open inside me. I realized I had spent most of my life waiting for my family to see me, to validate me, to finally say I was enough. But for the first time, I felt the weight lift, because I no longer needed it. Their approval was not the currency of my life anymore. The weeks passed, and the phone calls from my mother grew fewer but sharper. She accused me of betrayal, of humiliating her in front of guests. When I refused to argue, she turned to cold silence. I thought it would pierce me as it always had. But instead, I found peace in the quiet. My father wrote again, shorter notes this time, describing his meetings, the coins he earned for each milestone. Daniel called less often, his voice subdued. His once unshakable confidence cracked. Victoria never returned to him. One evening, I sat at my kitchen table in Dayton. A stack of papers from the lawyer spread before me, my tea steaming gently beside them. The apartment was quiet except for the faint sound of Mrs. Green closing up her bakery downstairs. I looked at the documents, at the careful signatures and clauses that proved I could not be erased, and I felt stronger than I ever had. Later that week, I met with Dr. Kim again. As I described the legal steps, the letters from my father, and my mother's silence, she asked how I felt. I paused for a long moment before answering. For the first time, I said, "I do not feel like I need them to tell me who I am." Her smile was small but genuine. "That, Clara, is freedom." I walked out of her office that day into the crisp February air. The sky streaked with pale winter sun. My breath came steady, not with the weight of carrying their shame, but with the clarity of carrying only my own truth. For the first time in my life, I realized I was free to move forward without dragging their voices behind me. Spring in Dayton unfolded slowly, each week bringing longer light through my apartment windows and new shoots of green along the sidewalks. Work at Dayton Digital Solutions grew steadier with each passing month. The whispers about my divorce, the doubts about my stability, all faded as my projects spoke louder than gossip ever could. Clients began asking for me by name, praising my strategy and the way I could turn an idea into a campaign that connected with people. For the first time, I felt respected not because I was someone's daughter or someone's wife, but because of the work I had built with my own hands. The stability of my job gave me space to breathe. But what surprised me most was the way my life began to root itself outside of the office. I started volunteering on weekends at the Springfield Community Shelter. The first time I walked through those doors, the air thick with the smell of soup and the chatter of children, I felt something inside me loosen. There was no judgment here, No silent measuring of worth. Only people. Helping one another with what they had. It was at the shelter that I met Harold Evans. A high school English teacher with kind eyes and an easy laugh. He was in his early 30s. With sleeves often rolled up and hair that never seemed to lie perfectly flat, Harold ran the literacy program for the kids, teaching them how to tell their own stories through reading and writing. We started talking while stacking boxes of donated food one Saturday morning. And our conversations grew into long walks after shifts. Cups of coffee shared at the small diner around the corner. And eventually evenings, where laughter filled my kitchen as easily as the scent of Mrs. Green's bread drifting up from downstairs. Harold never asked me to be anyone other than who I was. He did not need me to explain my past or prove my worth. He listened when I spoke about my family, about the Christmas that had broken me open. And he nodded with quiet understanding instead of judgment. One night, as we walked through the park, snow beginning to dust the ground, he said, "You know, Clara, you are the bravest person I know. Not because you fought back, but because you chose to stop hiding." His words sank deep. Not as flattery, but as recognition. The months passed quickly. By autumn, my father had reached out again. His voice was steadier, more open. And he told me about his progress in AA. He did not ask me to come home, did not push for reconciliation on his terms, but simply told me he was proud of me for standing my ground. It was the closest thing to healing we had ever shared. My mother remained distant. Our contact reduced to polite but brief exchanges. I no longer begged for her approval. And without that hunger, her silence no longer cut as deep. Christmas of 2024 arrived with crisp air and streets glowing with lights. Instead of driving to the house in Springfield where I had grown up, I walked into the shelter with Harold by my side. Together with the other volunteers, we decorated the long tables with paper snowflakes cut out by children, laid out trays of turkey, mashed potatoes, and pies donated by local bakeries. The room filled quickly with families, laughter spilling into the air, the clatter of dishes mixing with the hum of conversation. I moved between the tables with plates in my hands, smiling at children whose faces lit up at something as simple as a cookie, shaped like a star. Harold read aloud to a group of kids in the corner, his voice animated, his arms sweeping wide as they giggled. Margaret, the retired teacher I had met my first day at the shelter, hugged me tightly and whispered, "Look at you, Clara. You've made this place better." As the evening went on, I stood at the back of the room for a moment, watching. The glow of string lights reflected off smiling faces. Voices rose in laughter. And there was no trace of the shame I had once carried like a shadow. These people were not bound to me by blood, but by choice, by kindness, by the willingness to show up for one another. For the first time in my life, I understood what family could mean when it was not poisoned by judgment. I thought back to that Christmas table in Springfield, to my mother's laughter and the silence that followed, and I felt nothing but distance. I no longer feared their words or their silence. I had chosen my own path, built on truth and self-respect, and it had led me here, to a room filled with warmth that was real. When Harold walked over, brushing flour from his hands after helping in the kitchen, he smiled and asked if I was happy. I looked around the room, at the people who had become part of my new life, and nodded. More than happy. I said, "I feel free." As the night wound down and families carried leftovers home, I helped fold up tables and stack chairs, the sound of laughter still echoing in the room. The cold air outside felt gentle this time, not cutting. And when Harold reached for my hand, I let him hold it. Steady and sure. I had once believed that being the family's shame was the worst fate I could endure. But standing there, surrounded by people who valued me as I was, I realized something powerful. The only shame worth carrying is the shame of denying yourself the life you deserve. I was done with that. I had chosen differently. and that choice had given me everything I truly needed. If you have ever faced moments where family made you feel small or unworthy, I would love to hear your story. Share it in the comments below, and if this journey spoke to you, please like this video and subscribe so you can join me for more stories about strength, justice, and the courage to build a life on your own terms.